Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Friday weekend edition, and we're so grateful that you can join us. If you'd like to join us a little bit later, we'll open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. We are going to be hitting lots of issues simultaneously, and we'll try to cover as many as we can. But this has been a busy week, and there are some things that oftentimes are not covered by the mainstream press that we're going to cover here today. Of course, we have in studio with us once again Lathan Watts, who is the director of Dr. Merrill Matthews, a resident scholar at the Institute for Policy Innovation. First thing I thought we might talk about, Dr. Matthews, since you were the one that recommended it, is the Federal Election Commission has fined the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign for lying about the funding of the Russian dossier. Now, there are questions that people always have. Are any of these people ever going to be brought to account? And through this program today, I'm going to talk about the fact that sometimes it takes a while, and the wheels of justice sometimes grind slowly, but this, I think, is an indication that what we suspected many years ago is now actually been proven, and actually an individual was fined for this.
They were. The Democratic National Committee was fined about $800-some-odd-thousand, and the Clinton campaign was fined $100-some-odd-thousand. So I think it worked out to be about $1 million for the two groups together. Not a lot. I mean, that's about a Bill Clinton speaking fee back when they thought when they thought his wife was going to be president.
Yes.
But it is significant because so many in the media have generally sort of disregarded that. They just ignore the dossier, the Clintons' role in this. A little while back, because I listened to National Public Radio on Saturday mornings, I usually listen to it every morning on their news source. Scott Simon had on Hillary Clinton here some months ago when she had just published a novel she'd co-written with somebody else, and he gave time to her to talk about how Donald Trump was undermining democracy and so forth. He was out of the office, but and didn't raise the question about what about the Steele dossier?
Yes, and again, this I think is an illustration that sometimes people don't hear the rest of the story. And over the next couple of minutes, I'm going to mention some of these cases where actually there have been some victories, and there has been justice. One I'll just mention in passing, but won't even get into. One of those individuals was one of the rioters in Portland. He got 10 years in prison. And so some people say, what happened to those people that rioted? Well, some of them are doing hard time. Others, it's taken a while. And this is a good example because, Lathan, this dossier has been the justification and the pretext for all sorts of invasions of privacy into candidate Donald Trump, as well as President Donald Trump. And the Clintons have been able to get away with a lot, but not this time.
Yeah, I mean, at least they're going to have to pay some money.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
it's not the same as having somebody perp walked, I understand. But.
Yeah, and it's not the same that would happen to anybody else if they were caught red-handed doing this. If you were just some, Yahoo from Northeast Arkansas running for Congress and pulled something like this, you would likely be in much, much hotter water than just paying a fine. I mean, this, as we've said on here before, this was the basis for all the FISA warrants, all the secret wiretapping, all the spying on the campaign and everything else. And everybody involved knew it was nonsense. Everybody involved knew it was made up. And I mean, I'm glad to see, something come of it, but there should be heads rolling at the Justice Department over this too. Everybody that was involved in those warrants and all of that. But this is also, I mean, this is the Clinton MO on every scandal that's ever involved them. You just lie about it, deny until it's factually proven in front of everybody. But you've been denying it for so long. The media's been ignoring it for so long that by the time something actually comes out and says that you can't deny, well, that's old news.
It's
I don't know why we're talking about that anyway. It's time to move on. I mean, what are we doing still talking about this stuff?
And we've got a second example of that this week with Hunter Biden.
Oh, there we go.
That
was where I wanted to take you. Okay, go for it.
Well, they've come out and said, well, in fact, we think maybe Hunter Biden actually did do some of these things, and it looks like there may have been some money coming from China to him. And who's the big guy that he was giving 10%, that demanded 10% to? But basically the media ignored this story, said it was false, got a whole bunch of former, I guess it was security people or something saying
intelligence
officials saying we don't believe this is really the case. This is made up stuff. And it turns out that, in fact, it wasn't made up stuff. And now the Justice Department, to its credit, has been going on sort of behind the scenes looking at this, and we'll see what comes from it. But this could be very explosive if the Justice Department has the goods on Hunter Biden.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Keep tuning in, because I got a feeling there's some other shoes that are going to drop. There's still some investigations out there, right?
Yeah, and I mean, just again, I think I've said on here before, if there's really a divide in America, it's between the governing and the governed.
Yes.
Okay, because if you or I had a laptop with incriminating evidence on it, evidence of corruption and bribes and all of this other stuff, and I personally took it to a laptop repairman, and there was a witness that placed me as the guy who came and dropped it off and signed for the receipt and never got around to picking it up, and then somebody eventually does get it and shows the evidence of all of the bribes and corruption that were on my laptop, and I tried that's Russian disinformation defense. What do you think would happen to me?
Yes.
I mean, I would be under the jail by now.
Yes.
And I think it was Dan Bongino I heard talking about this earlier this week, and he said what you will see the media try to spin this as, this is a Hunter Biden scandal. This is a Joe Biden scandal.
Yes, it is.
And that will, you just wait. If they're forced to talk about it, you will hear about all these allegations against Hunter Biden, and count how many times you hear Joe Biden's name in those stories.
Sure. Well, and we're going to get to that in just a minute, because our second article here is a very good article written by Dr. Merrill Matthews about Kamala Harris. But just as we go to a break, some people might say, well, would it have made a difference? And of course, our friends at the Media Research Center went and did interviews with individuals in the 6 swing states and concluded that indeed many of these individuals that voted for Joe Biden, if they had known about, for example, the Hunter Biden case and one or two others, would have either not voted for Joe Biden or would have voted for Donald Trump. And if you do the numbers, you can figure out very quickly that we'd be talking about a reelected Donald Trump in office. But even more recently, we quoted from John Lott, who went back and looked at some of these numbers. But if you just look at the 3 key states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, if you flip just 43,000 votes in just those 3 states alone, you are talking about, again, the reelection of Donald Trump. And, of course, I shared with some of you guys that if you look at the House and Senate, 32,000 votes in 5 House races, Republicans would have controlled the House of Representatives. If you give 14,000 additional votes to former Senator David Perdue, Republicans control there. So for less than 90,000 votes nationwide in the right places, you would have Republicans controlling all branches of government, and right now we have Democrats controlling all branches of government. So these matter. And so, if nothing else, did want to talk about this idea of the fining of the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton. But some people are wondering, Dr. Merrill Matthews, in light of all the things being said by Joe Biden, what would happen possibly if he did step down, or if the 25th Amendment were used? What would it be like if Kamala Harris were the president? And you have a very good article talking about how she's performed as vice president. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Since it's April 1st, you might conclude that the Democratic Party is engaged in an elaborate April Fool's joke, but it appears that the leadership is serious. The latest polls show that a majority of American voters agree that President Biden and Democrats are out of touch with hardworking Americans and have been so focused on catering to the far left wing of the party. The poll also found that a majority of voters explicitly say they wanted Biden and Democrats to move closer to the center and embrace more moderate policies versus embracing more liberal policies. And an even higher percentage of independents selected that option on the poll. These are not the percentages you would like to see moving into the midterm elections. But it gets worse. American voters don't like the leftism of the party, but they also don't like the lying. Charles Cook talks about the diminishing return of Democrats' lies. He has a long list. The leaders of the Democratic Party are lying about inflation. It wasn't going to happen. It's transitory. Then it's due to the war in Ukraine. They're lying about gas prices, for which Joe Biden is or isn't responsible, depending on the day you ask them, and which have inspired the most incoherent set of policy answers in recent memory. And they're lying about Afghanistan. Charles Cook acknowledges that President Biden may not be responsible for everything wrong in America, but we would be better served by a president and a Democratic Party leadership with more modesty, clarity, and candor. He concludes that voters may tolerate a flim-flam artist when times are good, but as the recent election shows, they sour swiftly when trouble rears its head. It's becoming more obvious each day that the midterm elections will be difficult for Democratic candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, in studio with us today, Lathan Watts and Dr. Merrill Matthews. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Going to be talking about everything from the Keystone XL pipeline. Of course, we'll be getting into what's happening in Ukraine. All the questions as to whether or not we need to just raise taxes even more. Well, there's a good idea right during the midterm elections. And we will talk about Disney. But one of the articles that we've posted is by Dr. Merrill Matthews. Will Kamala Harris rank as one of the worst VPs in history? So I guess we need to talk about why you actually wrote this piece.
Well, Kerby, I occasionally see emails and studies from academics, from pollsters and so forth that rank the best and worst presidents in the past. And so I got to thinking, do they do that for vice presidents as well? Because I don't see that very often. And they are out there. They're not quite as frequent and abundant as the presidents, but they do some. And I looked over the list and I saw there's several names that appear, but it seemed like for the vice presidents, the subject matter, it's a lot more subjective because the vice president doesn't have a job except being president of the Senate, and they don't do that very often. They don't go in there very often. And so that means that the real job of the vice president is not to embarrass the president of the United States.
Maintain a pulse and don't embarrass the other guy.
Just stay out of the headlines and don't embarrass the president. And Kamala Harris embarrasses the president and the country regularly with the speeches and other things that she's doing. And that just got me thinking because her poll numbers down. In fact, I pulled off Real Clear Politics' latest poll numbers for her. And I mentioned in the piece that she's doing even worse than Joe Biden in the polls. So from Real Clear Politics, from January through the end of March, her favorable rate's 37.3%, unfavorable 51.2%. That's low. And everybody knows it. And so I just look at the issue of why is this the case? And I provide in there some sound clips of some of her speeches. And as people who, if you speak in public every now and then, give speeches, or you're just having to do something, you make a mistake every now and then. Certainly. You sometimes get your words twisted, you forget something or so forth. But Kamala comes out with this word salad of stuff that you listen to it and you just laugh when you hear it.
You have to.
And it's not like she's just talking to somebody, at the White House or something. These are major speeches in Poland where she can't figure out where she is. It's just bizarre. And so the amazing thing is that Biden still lets her go out and give speeches. But at any rate, she was initially put in charge of the border, and that's gotten nothing but worse since then. And then she had to try to defend it, and that's gotten terrible in her defenses of it. And now she's giving speeches out there and around countries that are threatened by Russia, and where you want to make sure that you convey this notion of strength and security and so forth. And she comes out, let's talk about the significance of the passage of time. The significance of the passage of time is really significant about the passage of time. And what are you doing? So that's why I did it, just to put it out there. I think she will ultimately end up being considered one of the worst 5 presidents in history. Now, I mentioned it's only 3 years into it, so if she has the other only a year into it, so there's a mistake. Yeah. She has basically 3 more years. She might do much better in that time, but no, I don't think anybody really expects that.
Well, I mean, she's got nowhere to go but up.
Right?
I think the V in VP stands for vapid at this point.
Yes.
And I mean, it's like you said, I mean, everybody knows it. I mean, she's the emptiest pantsuit in all of Washington, D.C. And I think, I mean, I read your article and didn't disagree with any of it. But what it made me think of was not, is she the worst VP ever? Was she the worst VP choice?
And
ever?
that's actually a point, because some of the polls out there look at VPs versus VP choices, and that's because if you're, in some cases you're just a choice. You're not a past president unless you won, but in many cases you have the VP choices, and Sarah Palin got a lot of flack.
Oh, absolutely. I mean that was a bad choice, and this one, I remember at the time when we were probably on here questioning like. I have no idea why Biden picked her. She brings you absolutely nothing to the ticket, because your piece talks about sometimes regional balance or a competitive state or whatever. You're going to get California without Harris. I mean, it doesn't.
She brings no expertise to this that Biden didn't already have.
Nothing. She brought absolutely nothing to this ticket, and so I look back at it like who made and. Who advised Biden like, oh yeah, this is the way to go, right? And unfortunately, I think it's the left's penchant for identity politics.
Right.
I think it was a choice made solely on her skin color and sex, which for a party that can't define either, I don't know how you come to that decision either.
Sounds like the Supreme Court nominee we talked about.
It's a good point, but there were, even if you say, and I don't fault him for saying I'm going to go for a woman of color. I think that's fine from my standpoint, but there had to be a number of other better options out there, and I think there was one in Florida he was considering, which might have been a stronger candidate, might have put Florida in play for Democrats in the future and so forth. It's a mystery to me why he chose this particular person. Now with Judge Ketanji Jackson, Brown Jackson.
KBJ.
She, whether you agree with or disagree with her, she's articulate, except for being able not to define a woman, but she was articulate. She's smart. She knows her stuff. You may disagree with her ideologically, but she's a very articulate person. I'm just mystified as to why he chose her. I'm talking about Colin Harris.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk about that, because on the second page you give us some history. And again, I recognize that some of our listeners were not around in 1972, but I was.
Some of us were.
And but obviously Lathan was not. And so we remember, and you give us a reminder about the fact that there were people trying to talk Richard Nixon out of having Spiro Agnew on the ticket. But again, he reportedly said, well, one of the reasons is because no assassin in their right mind would kill me. Now, once they got rid of Spiro Agnew because of some scandals in Maryland, then you brought in Gerald Ford, and Gerald Ford ended up being the president over time. So it reminds me of a quote I used the other day. One of my political science professors used to quote Otto von Bismarck, God has a special providence for fools, drunkards in the United States of America, because we've had times in which a president has been assassinated, Lincoln or Garfield, times when individuals have died in office, and all of a sudden Calvin Coolidge, or in some cases people step down, Gerald Ford become the president. And in every case, it's worked out pretty well, actually, surprisingly so, with the exception, of course, of the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson after Lincoln. But again, this is the question a lot of people are asking right now, Dr. Merrill Matthews, and that is, given all the things we talked about last week, you weren't with us, but Lathan and Penna did a pretty good job of talking about all the things that this president has said, which implied that we were sending troops into Ukraine, that we were training troops in Poland, that we would use chemical weapons, that we wanted regime change. A lot of people, even in the Democratic Party, are saying maybe it is time to really ask this president to step down or to use the 25th Amendment. But there are many people saying the protection is because Kamala Harris as president causes some people some concerns.
I think Joe Biden is safe from that aspect for it. And, I mentioned that she embarrasses him, but and he doesn't need any help embarrassing himself because he does that all the time.
He does a great job.
Now, again, but is maybe one of the reasons why he picked her is that she is Teflon, in the sense that most people are seeing right now that this individual is not working very well as vice president. And it's not just us, because you also talk about the fact that this staff is abandoning the sinking ship. I don't know I've ever seen a vice president lose so many people in the office, but still, the mainstream press doesn't want to point out too many of the problems with Kamala Harris.
They treat her very kindly, I would think, and much more so than they did with Dan Quayle and many of the others that they just ridicule regularly. I still remember a political cartoonist saying with Dan Quayle, "I sure hope he gets reelected because this gives me material for the next 4 years." And they just abused him. They went after him so much. They don't do that with Kamala.
Yes, and again, African-American woman, assuming you can identify race and sex, which is, by the way, Penna Dexter's commentary today, Define a Woman, so we may get to that a little bit later. But we'd love to get your thoughts, because that is a question on many people's mind. Is it possible that the current president would be asked to step down? We've seen that before. Remember Howard Baker coming to Richard Nixon and other things like that. Could it be possible that one of the leaders in the Senate actually would sit down and say, I don't think this is going to work in the future? Or is that just security by having a vice president that, as Dr. Merrill Matthews has pointed out, isn't well respected and yet is being ignored pretty much by the mainstream press? By the way, you didn't get a lot of great accolades with this, did you?
Twitter exploded with that.
Well, if you'd like to read it, it is on our website, and of course you can go to The Hill as well, and it's our second article, but we have a lot to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You know, we started the program here by talking about the fact that, maybe some justice is done, and I want to give you some other examples before we get into another article, this one by Dr. Merrill Matthews about Keystone XL pipeline and, of course, what's going on in Ukraine. And that is, if you go back to some of my commentaries, 2 years ago, I talked about the fact that there had been a judgment in favor of Oberlin College because they were really, in a sense, these students were trying to drive this bakery, Gibson's Bakery, out of business. And that one now just recently was upheld on appeal, and that came from the 9th District Court of Appeals. But again, if you're not familiar with this, it goes all the way back 5 years ago, in which you had the school was accused of actually being racist and doing racial profiling because the bakery owner stopped 3 Oberlin College students who were African American from stealing wine bottles, and that happened actually in 2016, so that goes even back 6 years. And the bottom line is that this illustrates that sometimes we have a cancel culture in which those who want to do this want to ruin the lives of individuals, ruin their careers, maybe even end their careers, and even drive, in this case, a bakery out of business. And you might say, well, how did they end up suing Oberlin College? Oh, well, that's because the dean of students actually was passing out flyers and protesting and all the rest. And then they were doing a boycott preventing Oberlin College from buying any bakery goods. They were ruining the reputation of that. And sometimes people just wonder, well, is there any justice in the world? And the answer is, let me come to you, Lathan Watts, yes. And we oftentimes talk about how some of these bakeries and some of these individuals doing cakes and things like that have really had to stand up for their religious liberty. This one doesn't have so much to do with religious liberty, but with character assassination. But once again, we see a victory. Sometimes people say, how do we fight the cancel culture? Well, we try to fight it with facts. But if they don't see the light, maybe they'll feel the heat. And this is a $32 million victory for this bakery over Oberlin College there in Ohio.
Yeah, it's $32 million worth of justice. And I'm just sad that it took so long.
Yes,
and that
that's the sad
article,
part, yeah.
That article points out that Oberlin College, part of their legal strategy was to drag it out as long as they could because one of the men who was suing them was terminally ill. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to talk about, just mean-spirited
people.
Yes. Tactic, that's exactly what Oberlin College did. But they're still going to have to pay the piper. And this, if people want to know, like, what do we do about cancel culture? This is what you do about it.
Yes.
You fight it every inch of the way. You never, ever give an inch. And the owners of this bakery were completely within there. The people were stealing from them.
Yes.
And he reported the people who were stealing. And those people were arrested and convicted for stealing from him. And for doing that, because the people who were stealing from him happened to be black, some people decided that this guy must be a racist and racially profiling. No, he's a business owner who's trying to prevent his business from being robbed.
Right.
And it wouldn't make a lick of difference to him if you were black, white, or purple with blue polka dots. If you steal from me, I'm reporting you to the police. That's all he did. This is the only way this stops, is when nonsense like this happens, you have to go right back at them just as hard as they came at you, and eventually make them pay for it. And if everybody who is a victim of this sort of cancel culture, if that's what you want to call it, would do the same thing, and I think we're seeing some examples of that now, right? The other side will finally have some skin in the game and maybe think twice about doing this when you're going to be on the business end of litigation that could cost you money. So if you want to know, what do we do about cancel culture? Hopefully you're never a victim of it, but if you are, you have to fight back. And if it's related to your religious beliefs, then there are folks like us who would be happy to help you fight back and not charge you for it. But if it's in other areas like this, maybe you do have to lawyer up. But this is the only way it's ever gonna turn the corner.
I was just thinking too. The reason this worked is because they did have a district attorney that wanted to actually prosecute those
crimes.
individuals.
Imagine
because some of our listeners out there in the San Francisco Bay Area are going, "Yeah, I wish we would have a district attorney that would allow us to prosecute these individuals that are stealing from some of these pharmacies and grocery stores." And some of our listeners up in Illinois are saying the same thing about what's happening in Chicago and those kinds of things. So, go ahead.
So what's the rationale for the defense behind the guys who did the stealing? I mean, it's just
there's no rationale.
They had to make some kind of case, and apparently some of the courts agreed with them, didn't they?
I think what happened was, and I'll have to go back and look at it a little more in detail, but the people who were caught stealing, I don't think really. It was really Oberlin College and the folks that started the protests who said this business owner was racially profiling. Like he must have been just watching them because when they entered the store and they were black, he started paying attention. Racial profiling it's wrong. You shouldn't do it. Okay. However, even if that's why he was watching them, they stole from him.
There is a reason for this.
And he reported it.
That's why he paid attention.
Right. I mean,
yes. And I'm just thinking about, I wanted people to know about this because maybe they're familiar with Nicholas Sandmann, who has made a fair amount of money. You might remember he was the young individual that was there for the pro-life rally in Covington, Kentucky. And in January 2019, this Native American Indian comes up and there are all sorts of things being said about him that were not true. And he actually won those cases. I think Kyle Rittenhouse, you might remember him with the AR-15 up there in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So the point I'm making is that sometimes people, and whether you want to call it cancel culture or just mean-spirited out there, want to ruin the reputation of individuals, want to ruin the reputation of a business, want to drive people in some situations. There are, unfortunately, some examples of people that just couldn't take it anymore and committed suicide. So these are issues that we need to address, and I just think it's good. And just real quickly, as a transition, you are still fighting this case about Sweet Cakes Bakery right there in Oregon. That is a religious liberty issue.
Certainly.
But again, whether it's them or whether it's, of course, Coach Kennedy, you got less than a month now before the oral arguments are going to be heard on that. In every case, if you don't stand up for your religious liberty, if you don't stand up for your reputation, then you're going to have more problems with that in the future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nobody wakes up wanting to be a client of First Liberty Institute, right? I mean, I get it, right? But, we can't do our work without clients. Somebody has to say, no, I'm not going to put up with this. And if you're willing to take that stand and you contact us and, we'll represent you for free. And some of the cases, in fact, probably, I would guess probably most of our cases we're able to resolve without going to court.
And you have an incredible win factor that most people don't know about if they weren't listening to Point of View.
Yeah, exactly. And so, we seek to win for our client, however our client defines winning. Sometimes it's just they want to be left alone or to get the person on the other side to do the right thing. And if we can do that without litigation, we will. And then there are other cases like Coach Kennedy where it becomes clear the other side's not going to do the right thing. And so we have to go to court. And then the case, in his case, becomes bigger than even him, and he understands that. That's why you would put up with all this for going on 6+ years now, because he sees that there is a chance here for a much bigger win for everybody, and that will include vindicating him, of course.
Does First Liberty sometimes take cases and say, we'll probably lose this, but we need to take it anyway?
There's a lot of factors that go into if we take a case or not. There are some cases that absolutely you just gotta fight this, and maybe we don't know if we're going to win it or not. But you also have to, like, the flip side of that too is you don't want to rush into court in a bad jurisdiction and end up making bad law because you lose, right? Because the Supreme Court's really only going to hear about 1% of the appeals that make it that far. So if you're we tend to look at what are the facts, what's the law. and the client and the jurisdiction, right? I mean, I'm sure there are cases where we're like, well, we'll probably lose at the district court level, but this is in a good circuit, right? So if we can get it to the Circuit Court of Appeals, we can win there, and then the likelihood is, it doesn't go to the Supreme Court, and you've made good law in that circuit.
Yeah. Well, again, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to get into some other issues, but I just want you to know that there are a lot of victories out there that you would probably only hear on Point of View. Next week, of course, we're doing our Truth Team, and have actually asked a number of our listeners to tell us what they appreciate about this program, and one of the things that surfaces time and time again is you give me some hope. I don't hear that these kinds of cases are being won, except on Point of View, and of course, we try to talk about many of the religious liberty cases, but I want to give you some that are in other areas, other jurisdictions that maybe you didn't know about, but you heard about them here. We come back, though, we're going to talk about Ukraine, the pipeline, Vladimir Putin. Got a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
A couple of weeks ago, University of Pennsylvania senior Leah Thomas won an NCAA championship in women's swimming, setting an Ivy League time record for the 500-yard freestyle. Thomas, a former male swimmer for Penn, has dominated the female competition this year. Commentator and podcaster Matt Walsh observed Leah's demeanor at the winner's podium. Thomas, he writes, did not make any effort at all to sound or appear womanly. He was accepted as a woman because he declared himself to be so. Parents who complained in a letter about Thomas's presence in Division I women's swimming said the NC2A dismissed their concerns outright. Mr. Walsh pointed out that the left makes little effort to explain, defend, or justify gender ideology. They just demand that it is obeyed and expect that to be the end of the conversation. Indeed, Senator Marsha Blackburn tried to have a conversation about this issue when, in a hearing conducted by the Senate Judiciary Committee, she asked President Biden's Supreme Court nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson to provide a definition for the word woman. The nominee replied that she could not and stated, "I am not a biologist." USA Today's report on the exchange stated, quote, "Scientists, gender law scholars, and philosophers of biology said Jackson's response was commendable, though perhaps misleading. It's useful, they say, that Jackson suggested science could help answer Blackburn's question, but they note that a competent biologist would not be able to offer a definitive answer either. Scientists agree there is no sufficient way to clearly define what makes someone a woman. And with billions of women on the planet, there is much variation." End quotes. It's almost comical to watch the media tiptoe around the word woman. When Arizona legislators passed a 15-week abortion ban, one article stated that abortion advocates are warning that the ban would be harmful to people who can get pregnant. People who can get pregnant. Why didn't Ketanji Jackson think of that? For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're going to talk about Ukraine. And, of course, we even earlier this week spent some time talking about various organizations you might want to support that are helping people in Ukraine or helping those that have actually made their way into Poland or other countries. But I thought we would, for a minute, just back up and look at a couple of issues. Our third article is also by Dr. Merrill Matthews, having to do with the Keystone XL pipeline. The one after that by Roger Boyes, Don't Bet bet on the end of Vladimir Putin? Are we going to have regime change? And then we thought it would be good because there's a very good piece that came out in the Daily Wire, what we saw when we went to Ukraine. But let's take them piece by piece. First of all, when this president decided on the very first day in office that he would actually end the Keystone XL pipeline, you start your article by reminding us that now the Biden administration is trying to get oil from Venezuela.
Yes. Yeah, there's been reports and of the administration secretly discussing things with the Nicolas Maduro, the head of Venezuela, in an effort to try to get their, because we have sanctions on them, we're not buying their oil. It's also a problem for them because once Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry in Venezuela, and Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. So it was a major, source for them. And back when Hugo Chavez was doing this, and oil was $100 a barrel for a while, it was bringing a lot of money in and allowing him. And so people were able to say, look, socialism works. Money's coming into the system and so forth. Then oil starts tanking, and it's created a huge problem for them. And we impose sanctions on them, and we're not buying their oil anymore. So that's sort of the background on the story. And they don't actually produce that much anymore because they're so bad at doing it from the government standpoint.
Yes.
So what happened was, as you mentioned, on Biden's first day of office, he canceled the Keystone XL pipeline. It had been an on-again, off-again thing for several years. And just so our listeners know, the Keystone XL pipeline that's not a new pipeline. It's part of a Keystone pipeline system that's been up and running and pumping Canadian oil into the U.S. refineries for over a decade. It's been around for a long time. The Keystone XL was just going to be another pipeline that started at the same place in Alberta, Canada, come through Montana, go into Nebraska to the same place that the other Keystone pipeline went to, Steel City, Nebraska, and to come down to Texas to the Gulf Coast to be able to refine that oil because it's heavy oil, and Gulf Coast refineries in Texas are able to do that. But they eventually canceled it. That was going to bring about 800,000 barrels a day of oil into the U.S.
Yeah, 800,000.
800,000 barrels a day. How many barrels of oil were we taking from Venezuela in its heyday? About 800,000 barrels of oil a day. And so what happened the Keystone XL would have actually just essentially offset the oil that we had been getting from Venezuela. Now, over the past few years, 4 or 5 years, that as we imposed sanctions, we were getting less and less from Venezuela. I don't think we get any now. But in order to replace that, we were getting more and more from Russia.
Yes, we were.
And so one of the things that comes up now is, as we're imposing sanctions on Russia, we get a percentage of our oil from Russia because we ended up essentially canceling Venezuela and the Keystone XL.
And so, again, just makes no sense.
Yeah, and this is where if I lived in any of those states, Montana, Nebraska, any of those where the pipeline was supposed to be coming in, I would be calling my governor and saying, you know what, why don't we do this ourselves? Why don't Nebraska, you build your section of it. Montana, you build your section of it. Dakotas, you build your section of it, and make Biden try to come stop us. I mean,
What eventually happened was that the company decided, once Biden did that, they said, all right, a few months later, they said, we're just out of there. Here, we've been doing this for 10 years. We've been making investments. We've been trying to build the pipeline and so forth. We get a yes, then we get a no.
Right.
We get a yes, then we get a no. And we're just not going to do it anymore.
And from their perspective, that makes total sense. I think if the governors of those states involved got together and said, we're committed to build this pipeline and went back to Keystone, that, look, these governors are committed to doing it ourselves, despite if the federal government's not going to do it. I guarantee you, they weren't just building that pipeline just to be building a pipeline, right? It was going to make them money.
But because it crosses international lines, the federal government has a say in there about the environmental impact, and that's where it became an issue.
What about the environmental impact? Because they said that they would maybe ship some of this oil on trains. And you know how much I love trains.
Yeah,
but trains do have accidents, and pipelines rarely do.
And it costs a lot more to do it that way. And Jen Psaki did exactly that the other day when somebody was bringing that point up, and she said, oh, well, that that oil is still coming to the U.S. by train. Well, not necessarily, and some of it is actually being shipped over to China and
Yes,
other
it
things
is.
because it's on the West Coast. So some may be coming here, but not as much as could be otherwise. And if you're a pipeline builder out there, do you feel like we're going to go ahead and invest the money to build more pipelines in this administration?
Yes. I've met people in Alaska that have been working on the pipeline. I've met some people here as well. And that seems to be still the best technology. And yet the environmental mindset is pipelines are bad. And then look at this, because 800,000 barrels a day and then 800,000
That was
barrels
just a
from
Keystone.
Venezuela. Yeah, just Venezuela.
And it was supposed to stop in Montana and pick up 100,000 barrels a day from the Bakken Shale and bring it in.
Oh, it's just nuts.
Yeah, and Biden clearly understands that supply is the problem,
Yes.
because he's now saying, well, I'm going to tap into a third of the strategic oil reserve so that I
As if
can
that's
lower
going
your
to
gas
affect
prices.
anything.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Maybe a little bit.
It will for maybe a month.
Yeah.
And then what are you going to do? You're going to tap into another third of the. You clearly understand, somebody there understands supply and demand. That supply is the problem. If supply is the problem, then increase the supply.
Oh.
I mean, it's not.
But
it's
he
not
wants to
rocket
decrease
science.
the demand. He wants everybody to drive electric cars.
Yeah,
As
exactly.
if that's
Because
gonna
it'll
make a
save
difference.
you $80 a month on gas. Okay, well, you know what the car payment is on an electric car? Have you tried to buy one?
And I don't know if this is still true, but the depreciation of electric cars used to be much worse than standard cars. I don't know if that's still the case, but it used to be.
I might just mention, if you want more information, obviously, on some of the environmental issues, IPI.org, you've got some great articles there, and you've written quite a number. But just before we take a break, and we may carry this over, one of the other articles is Don't Bet on the End of Vladimir Putin. Now, there's been a real debate in the last couple of days, actually now a few weeks, because it sounded like Joe Biden really thought that we needed regime change and says, this guy's got to get out of there. And that's why they've been saying now, just read off your cue cards. Don't read anything and don't say anything else. But Roger Boyes reminds us that Putin's probably going to be there. And I'm really disturbed sometimes when I hear this idea that the only way this war in Ukraine will end is with Vladimir Putin out of office. I think that's really dangerous. What's your thoughts?
Well, I agree. I doubt he's going to leave office, and he may actually double down on things. We may see the Ukrainian war morph and go into something else where they're just trying to control the eastern part of that, in essence, to get a split like you have in North Korea and South Korea. But it would have to take somebody close to Putin to take him out if that were to happen. And I just don't. It could, but I doubt it.
Yeah, and who's going to replace him?
Yeah.
I mean, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. I mean, a choice between two devils is not a good choice, right? But every time, power abhors a vacuum, and if you don't know who's going to step into those shoes, and don't know that they're going to be somebody that is somebody that we can deal with, it's a huge risk, and it's incredibly dangerous for the president of the United States.
There it is.
To say something like that on the world stage. And then have his press secretary have to come back and say, oh, well, no, he was just speaking from his own moral outrage. When you're the president of the United States, your opinion is policy. And it was incredibly reckless of him.
Well, we'll cover a little bit more of this after the break, and then we have many other issues. And matter of fact, some people say maybe we have enough taxes, and yet the president wants to increase them. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Lathan Watts with us, who is the Director of Public Affairs, and of course, Dr. Merrill Matthews, resident scholar at the Institute for Policy Innovation. Last hour, we talked a little bit about the Keystone XL pipeline in Canada, a little bit about Vladimir Putin. I want to get into this issue of Ukraine and even some material that has come out about how this war on Ukraine has affected us in terms of sanctions, how it's really changed the world. But let me take a phone call first. We'll go to North Carolina. And Mike, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hello, my name is Mike. I'm from North Carolina. I did 20 years in the Marine Corps, but after I retired, I was working for Department of Homeland Security up in Michigan. A lot of people don't realize when you're talking about the environment and the problems with the pipeline coming through, most people don't realize Canada has agreement with Michigan to take their trash from, instead of dumping in their landfills, they bring more across the Ambassador Bridge to Michigan to dump in our landfills.
Wow.
In addition to that, remember when you were talking about the truckers in Canada and the long lines? So a lot of times when we were up at the Ambassador Bridge or the tunnel or even by some of the other ports, so what would happen with all these trucks would be backed up. These trucks would have hogs, or they'd have this trash, or they'd have other stuff that they're bringing over from Canada, and they'd have to wait until they got inspected. So for the trash trucks, they would just have to be x-rayed and stuff. But that's what's happening with Canada, bringing their trash and dumping it in our landfills. So imagine, since there's agreement with Michigan and Canada, imagine all the states on the northern border have that same agreement.
Wow.
That's probably just payback from when all the draft dodgers in America went to Canada, and so they took some of our trash, so now we're taking some of theirs.
But it's not that unusual for trash, especially recyclables, to be shipped to places. China and India and so forth have taken a lot of our recyclable material that we put through the recycling machines, and they pick up and they go through. So it wouldn't actually surprise me that goes on if Michigan has some space and they feel like they can make some money in that. And I don't know if you remember this, but years ago, New York was having fits.
Yes. I do remember that.
And they were, I think, taking it out to an island, weren't they? And just piling it up out there. But I often wonder, especially when I go through New York and on the day of trash day, and you see all these bags of trash out there, just huge amounts on one day. Getting rid of all that's got to be a real challenge.
And putting them in barges and all the rest. So there are a lot of environmental issues. And Mike, I appreciate that. I'm going to research that and see if I can find out a little bit more. But it's just a good illustration of some of the other topics that we want to get into. And one of those, which we've posted, is, what we saw when we went to Ukraine. So that is, I think, our fourth article. But this is something of real concern. We don't talk about it every day, but the devastation in one of the ports of the attacks in some of these cities and all of the rest. It's hard some days to even want to talk about it on the air because it is just so emotional. And since I have some neighbors literally across the street that have come from Russia, and the first thing you say is, look, we don't agree with Vladimir Putin, and we understand what this is like. And then you meet other people that are here from Ukraine, and we've even had some in this studio talking about this. This is going to have an impact far beyond even what's been taking place over the last month.
I think so, and I think something that Dr. Matthews alluded to previously, that and God bless the Ukrainians for standing up and fighting for their country.
Wow. Yes.
And if they can continue to do so, and I think they will, if Putin comes to the conclusion that he's not going to be able to take over the entire country and is willing to find an eastern portion of it that he would be okay with having so that he can save face and call it a win, if that's what he shifts tactics to, you are also likely to see this get worse before it gets better, because the Russian army historically, one of my heroes, VDH, Victor Davis Hanson, has talked about, they are not a good expeditionary force, but they are good at settling into wars of attrition. And if that's what he decides to do, I can control this eastern part of Ukraine, and I can just sit here and keep lobbing tank shells and mortar shells into Ukraine and say, we can do this all day. All you got to do is just let me have what I've already got, and we'll stop. Then I think, unfortunately, it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
There's a piece that came out just recently on how Russia's war on Ukraine will change the world, and there's 8 points, and I won't go through all of them, but, China is likely discouraged, not encouraged about territorial ambitions after seeing a quagmire there in Ukraine, or we could be witnessing the death throes of a superpower. Went through that about all the economic issues, demographic issues, and the rest affecting Russia. I love this one. There's no retirement home for old dictators, but beware an unhappy, unsuccessful nuclear-armed Putin, which we were talking about just a minute ago. Number 4, for aggressive states, being in the nuclear club is a must-have, because, again, that's what North Korea has told everybody around the world. We would probably have been invaded if we weren't a nuclear-capable country. Time to go back to deterrence school. That deterrence didn't work out so well, did it? Energy policy will be firmly anchored to security policy. Economic globalization is not dead, but we may have been seeing the end of it. And I love this one. Dust off your Samuel Huntington. Of course, he wrote the book, The End of the Clash of Civilizations. And when I was at Georgetown, actually was at a seminar where we shared a table. I don't know how I was able to pull that off, but nevertheless, I have been very familiar with him. Of course, read most of his books. But this Russia war in Ukraine is not only affecting Ukraine, it's affecting people around the world in terms of supply chains, cost of gasoline, and everything
refugees,
else.
And the United States is taking refugees in now. North Texas, where we are, the refugees are coming in from Ukraine. It's a major challenge. And even if Putin pulled troops back today, the devastation in Ukraine.
Unbelievable.
And I was thinking, how do you pay for all this? I mean, you had Berlin that was lots of Germany that was destroyed during World War II. It takes years. It takes a lot of money. And who's going to pay for that? Putin isn't going to have the money because we've imposed these sanctions on him, and he's not going to be able to pay for it. Ukrainians don't really have any money. Does the world step in to pay for the repair of these buildings and so forth? It's a huge challenge.
I think so. And again, we've talked about global energy prices, but I've also around this table talked about the metals. When we're off air, we were talking about lithium, but how about just something like nickel, which so much of it comes from Russia, and nickel actually is used in batteries, in armor plating, and turbine blades. But I do this one for Lathan. It's also used in electronic guitar strings.
That's right.
For a musician here. And when you start talking about that, and then you realize what's the breadbasket of Europe? Ukraine.
Yes.
And what that means when all of a sudden, if you had Russia and Ukraine, that's 102 metric tons. It's just unbelievable. Million metric tons. That's a tongue twister. But nevertheless, we're talking about some things where the impact will be for probably decades if we're really honest about that.
Yeah, it took decades after World War II for some of those economies to get back. It took it absolutely will take time, and it would help if, say, we had oil to sell. If we're going to try to help them economically, well, you have to have money to do that.
Yes. Well, let's take a break. Again, if you want to ask comments or make comments about Ukraine, fine, but we have some other topics to address, and we will do that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Since it's April 1st, you might conclude that the Democratic Party is engaged in an elaborate April Fool's joke, but it appears that the leadership is serious. The latest polls show that a majority of American voters agree that President Biden and Democrats are out of touch with hardworking Americans and have been so focused on catering to the far left wing of the party. The poll also found that a majority of voters explicitly say they wanted Biden and Democrats to move closer to the center and embrace more moderate policies versus embracing more liberal policies. And an even higher percentage of independents selected that option on the poll. These are not the percentages you would like to see moving into the midterm elections. But it gets worse. American voters don't like the leftism of the party, but they also don't like the lying. Charles Cook talks about the diminishing return of Democrats' lies. He has a long list. The leaders of the Democratic Party are lying about inflation. It wasn't going to happen. It's transitory. Then it's due to the war in Ukraine. They're lying about gas prices, for which Joe Biden is or isn't responsible, depending on the day you ask them, and which have inspired the most incoherent set of policy answers in recent memory. And they're lying about Afghanistan. Charles Cook acknowledges that President Biden may not be responsible for everything wrong in America, but we would be better served by a president and a Democratic Party leadership with more modesty, clarity, and candor. He concludes that voters may tolerate a flim-flam artist when times are good, but as the recent election shows, they sour swiftly when trouble rears its head. It's becoming more obvious each day that the midterm elections will be difficult for Democratic candidates. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, let's, if we can, spend a little bit of time talking about taxes, and that is one of the articles we've posted by Kevin Williamson. I might alert you that if you print it out, and I would encourage you to do so, it'll take you about 7 pages because there's a lot in there. And it's worth thinking about because 2 weeks from today normally is when we have to have our taxes paid, April 15th. Turns out the governor gives us a little bit more time, so they're actually due on April 18th on Monday, which is kind of interesting. Guess they didn't want us to pay taxes on Good Friday. But anyway, we'll have fun with that one some other day. But this gets us into, and maybe Lathan will come to you first because you've been chomping at the bit for this one. Because first of all, there are a few people, as he points out, that think taxes are too low. But most people think taxes are too high. But Joe Biden has concluded that, oh no, we need to really dramatically increase taxes. And he's proposed what's called a billionaire's tax. But normally you pay taxes for what you have actually received. That would be something through capital gains. But now we're going to tax imaginary income. Well, I know we're going to the virtual world, but this one is just off the charts, isn't it?
Yeah, you got to laugh to keep from crying, I guess, because what he's talking about are unrealized capital gains.
Right.
So, capital gain, like if you've invested in something at X and it goes up to Y, then your gain is the difference between those two. If you cash it out, then you've taken that gain. That's a realized gain. If you don't cash it out, it's basically just money on paper, right? I mean, in theory, you have made money. So they're already taxing capital gains. Now he wants to say, okay, well, you invested and your investments went up, X percent. Even though you didn't cash them out and take that gain, you made money on paper, so we want you to pay us. We're going to tax you on that. This would be anything from I mean, if you think, especially around here in North Texas, like it's just a yearly tradition at my house protesting my property tax bill to think that my house is worth what the assessor thinks it's worth. Well, wait until you have to start paying federal taxes on that too. Not just because your property tax bill went up, but hey, your local property tax assessor thinks your house is worth more than it was last year, so that's a capital gain. How about we're going to tax you on that too?
This is nuts.
It absolutely is. I mean, we live in a country that was founded on a tax revolt. Okay, people remember the Tea Party. You remember what Tea actually stood for? Taxed enough already. That's why the most recent Tea Party is not the Boston one. Yeah. The more recent one. That's what they were protesting.
Yeah, I would just say Americans don't like taxation, even with representation.
Absolutely, and you don't run whatever we are now, $20 trillion in debt because you have a revenue problem.
30 trillion.
30.
Yeah.
Because you have a revenue problem.
What's 10 trillion among friends?
Right. You run a deficit like that because you have a spending problem.
Yes.
And, I was thinking you were telling the people if you print this article out, it's going to be 7 pages. Try printing out the Internal Revenue Code. If you think it's astonishing to me, you can write an article about all the problems with the tax code and the article ends up being 7 pages. The tax code shouldn't be more than that. It really shouldn't.
It should not.
I mean, if you're going to tax income, which we had to amend the Constitution to even do,
right.
And when they did it, they said, oh yeah, it'll never get above about 10, 15, 20%. And then when Reagan ran, the highest rate was basically 90.
The marginal rate was 90%.
90%.
That's right. That is true.
It's you don't get into this position because we don't have enough tax revenue. You get into this position because you're spending more no matter how much tax revenue you have. You want to get the fiscal house in order. You don't do it via more taxation. You do it via fiscal discipline. You stop spending money you don't have.
Just imagine how complicated this is going to be. And for our listeners, if you had a little money in the stock market at the end of this past year, you may have seen that amount go down significantly the first 2 or 3 months of this year.
That's the other point, yes.
If you had to pick December 31st as the point that you had to say, hey, this is how much I had in my account, you might well be paying taxes on something that is half what it was then.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the point. That's the first thing, and those are with assets that are liquid, and you can sort of judge what the value of it is. But if you had invested in an antique car, or if you had a diamond that your parents left you, and it was the value of that diamond was going up, a diamond ring or something, and you have to go and assess this because even though they're saying it's a billionaire's tax, my understanding is it really hits people with 100 million and not a billion. That's a lot of money. That is a lot of money. But they only do this to get a foot in the door.
Yes.
Well, and at some point they start going down. And the point there is, how do you judge how much money somebody has? And this is especially true with property. Farmers out there who maybe inherited a large farm and they've got a large farm that the value has gone up. If you inherited your parents' house and the value of that house has increased by 20 or 30% over the last year or two, you may be subject to something like this at some point. How do you figure out what that value is? And that value may evaporate over the next year if we hit a recession.
And the folks on the left that want to talk about like these large agribusiness, that most of the farming in America is done corporately. Well, that's because you killed the family farm with the estate tax, because money that had been taxed half a dozen times already, by the time that farm was then handed down to the next generation, they couldn't afford the taxes on it anymore. Yeah. And who'd they end up selling to? Your favorite enemy, big food.
Yes.
It's big drug, big food, big whatever. That's how we got into this mess. My kids had to file tax returns this year. They're 15 and 17. Okay?
There's something seriously wrong with that.
No, of course not. If they are, they got some explaining to do. Because I certainly am not. No, it's because we have investment accounts that we put invested money, for college or whatever.
Sure.
And
set
those
aside.
accounts earned enough that it triggered a capital gains thing that we had to file.
Yeah, dividends, whatever. Yeah, sure.
And so, just like you said, I mean, they may be talking about billionaires, but when you're talking about capital gains taxes and taxes on investments, it is not just billionaires who live who live off of investments, because this is the reason they say they do it. Well, these billionaires, they don't pay income tax like the rest of us because they don't get a paycheck. They just live on investments. So they're going to pay their fair share when the top 1% is already paying about 90% of the tax bill. If they're going to pay their fair share, we got to tax investments. Retirees live on investments. Mm-hmm. People who are not wealthy at all, but who invested for their retirement, are now living on that investment income, and you're going after them.
Yes.
It is, one of Reagan's old quotes about if you want less of something, the Democrats' way of doing things is if it moves, tax it.
Yeah.
And then if it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. Right. You want more of something, or if you want less of something, you tax it.
Yes.
You want more of something, you incentivize it. And this disincentivizes investment, which is the most secure way to retire. You're looking at the entitlement, the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all of those that are insolvent already. If you want people to not have to depend on that as their source of income, then you have to encourage investment. And taxing it is a disincentive to do it.
And here's another irony in here. Joe Biden wants companies coming back to the U.S. so that we're not dependent upon companies overseas,
right,
offshore, for various parts of material that we have. So you have the supply chain issue. Except he's proposing raising the corporate tax rate from 21%, which it was lower to under Trump, to 28%. Joe, one of the reasons companies have been coming back is because they lowered the tax rate and made it easier for them to come back. Now you want to raise it to 28%, but even as you're trying to lure them back, you're doing the very thing that might force them to think maybe we should keep this company overseas.
Well, we're going to take a break, but let me encourage some of you to maybe join our conversation. We've got somebody here who wants to talk about Ukraine, but I think some of you want to talk about taxes. And one of the things that Lathan said, I might encourage you during the break, if you are near a computer, go to usdebtclock.org. It bothers me just to watch those numbers just keep clanking up there, but the federal tax revenue that they have on there is $4 trillion. And of course, it's $4.1 trillion. And of course, the expenditures are $6.5 trillion. Or to take some zeros off, imagine you were making $41,000 a year, but your bills each year were $65,000 a year. Would you have a problem? Yes, you would have a deficit of at least $24,000, right?
Look at the unfunded liability section on there. That's Social Security and Medicare,
yes,
money that we owe that we're not going to have revenue for, and then you get up into the hundreds of trillions of dollars.
Yes, you do, because you have Medicare, Social Security, defense. Of course, you have the interest on the debt and all sorts of stuff. By the way, if the interest rates keeps going up and the Fed wants to do that, then you have to pay more there as well. So just watch that debt clock and realize that it isn't that we are undertaxed. We are overspent, and that's pretty obvious. But again, you can check it out for yourself. And when we come back, we'll take some of those phone calls. Talk a little bit about the fact that we're coming up to tax day, but there's also a tax freedom day and even a cost of government day. I thought I'd give you some of those numbers. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook. Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
About a half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Lathan Watts, Dr. Merrill Matthews. Let's go to Texas. We've been talking about Ukraine. I think, Bo, you want to talk about that as well. So thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Anyway, I want to tell you first that from 85 to 87, I was stationed in Ukraine in the military.
Wow.
in a little town, Lutsk. And I have a heart for those people because my mom was Ukrainian. She passed away. And anyway, what I was going to tell you that some countries, they want to become nations to be like America, but they'll never be able to be independent because they always depended on somebody. They depended on Russia, before that, Ukraine, and just like people, some people can't be independent. They depend on somebody, on their bosses. And only independent people, they already came to America, and most of them are Christians that know that there's something better in life and everything.
Sure. And that I was just thinking that's really insightful because the difficulty in taking some of these countries that were part of the Soviet Union, where they were dependent on a centralized government, it's hard to develop a kind of an entrepreneurship. It's kind of hard to develop a real capitalist system. And given the fact that many of those countries also, and Ukraine being one of those, having a fair amount of corruption, it's hard to turn that into the United States in a republic overnight.
It's an important point because as these countries broke off from the Soviet Union, they often had leaders who were still friendly with the Soviet Union in some way or the other. And some Belarus, you might almost say, were Soviet stooges or Russian stooges. But the break wasn't as clean as one might like it. But Ukraine, because of they have a lot of natural resources there, especially with agriculture and so forth. So they potentially, I think, would have the ability to be able to not be as dependent or maybe even independent from other countries. And I go back to Milton Friedman in the piece he did for the series he did for PBS on Hong Kong, on Free to Choose. And there's a picture of him in a boat. He's going to Hong Kong. Hong Kong has no natural resources. It is a little island with a bunch of buildings and a lot of money and a lot of freedom. And he said, "Welcome to the freest country in the world." And it was Hong Kong, and that's not the case anymore. But the point being is, you can create a capitalist society with freedom, economic growth, and a lot of things, even if you don't have a lot of natural resources, and Ukraine does.
And again, part of that is the fact that in order for a capitalist system to work, you have to have a political system that has some level of trust, which is obviously a problem, and you need some sense of morality. So when we talk about this country, it's like a three-legged stool because you had a Judeo-Christian base, and we talk about religious liberty all the time. You had a free market idea, and you had a republic, and that works. But when you go into a former Soviet country, or even worse, when you go into a Muslim country, you have difficulty growing a democracy, much less a republic, from that particular foundation.
Yeah, and it's not like we need Ukraine to be a Jeffersonian democratic republic. And it's not like we need to make the world America, right? But communist countries will always be a threat for aggression and expansion because it's like Margaret Thatcher said, eventually run out of other people's money, right? And so they're constantly going to be an aggressor, and they're constantly going to be trying to expand and take in more people because it's a Ponzi scheme. You have to have more people coming in. So this is why they're a constant threat of aggression and expansion. So supporting countries that have come out of that and helping them become economically viable, it's in our own self-interest. When they don't need to be an aggressor anymore, that reduces our need to defend our allies elsewhere. And so, it doesn't have to look exactly like America, with a Constitution and three separate, here's your three branches of government and all that. It's not like we need to go out and make the world America, sort of like, British policy was make the world England. But it is in our interest to support these countries when they do break away from this and help them become economically viable.
And listeners need to understand, which I don't think we know. We talk about corruption here in a sense. Corruption in so many countries is just endemic. I mean, you can't get anything done.
That's right.
And Ukraine was trying to come out of that legacy of corruption, I believe, and I think they were probably making some progress, even though I think people would tell me that we still had a ways to go. But it's hard to do that in that kind of corrupt society because it just infiltrates everything.
Yes. Well, again, some people said, how is it that Hunter Biden, since we mentioned him earlier, was on the board of this energy company without any kind of expertise because he had connections. And that's the way it's done there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, no.
I mean, here, they might very well say, why are you bringing such and such on the board? He or she doesn't know anything about the business, or they don't run companies. They don't understand how that works. But there, everybody understood you wanted to have a connection to the White House.
Pretty amazing. Well, again, thank you both for that, and we'll take some more calls in just a minute. But we were talking about taxes, and I thought just before we run out of time, when we are talking about taxes, there are a couple of metrics that people have used over the years, and one is called Tax Freedom Day. And I sometimes do a commentary on that because it's the date in which your tax burden is lifted. What you do is you take all of the taxes collected in any year, and you divide that, of course, by the amount of income. And so Tax Freedom Day this year occurs on April 18th, which is either the same day in which our taxes are due. And yet that is the average. We broadcast all over the country. So those of you in Louisiana, you've already had your Tax Freedom Day. Those of you in New York,
it'd be 5 months from now.
Yeah. Actually, they don't get it until at least the middle of May, as best as I can figure it out. But here's the issue. We actually, as Americans, will pay more in taxes than we spend on food, clothing, and housing combined. So if you think we're just undertaxed.
Or at least before we used to spend that much on food, clothing, and housing. With inflation, we may be spending more.
But I want to do one more because you know Grover Norquist, right? And he put together a thing called the Cost of Government Day. Now, that's a little fuzzier because what that does is it looks at federal, state, and local taxes and the cost of regulation. Now, we can have a real debate about the cost of regulation, but let's use what he comes up with. And Cost of Government Day is sometime after the 4th of July. It was hard to kind of figure out which day it is, but some are there. So basically, half the year, Dr. Merrill Matthews, more than half the year, you're working for the government, aren't you?
Yes, and it's a huge amount that it becomes a huge burden on the economy because we're sending so much money through the government system. Some of it gets returned to us, but they take a large piece of it for themselves for various employees and other things, and the things that they want to do, the government wants to spend money on, sometimes for useful benefits and sometimes completely wasted.
It also kind of messes up the whole economic system because when the government is in there taking capital and when it's regulating so much, you don't have accurate signals in the free market. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned working for the government. Well, you're also not making the same salary as the people in government. If you look at, seriously, if you look at the average salary of a federal government employee versus the average salary in the private sector, it's roughly double.
Yes. And
they don't produce anything. Okay, the government doesn't produce anything. All they do is make it harder for the people who do produce things to produce them. It's almost better overall for the economy for you to be unemployed than working for the government, because all you're doing working for the government is making it harder on everybody else. Tom Coburn used to talk about how there were more people working for the Department of Agriculture than who work on farms in America, which meant every farmer had his own personal bureaucrat to tell him how to run his farm. That's a recipe for insolvency, and which. Take a look at the debt clock. Like you said in the last segment, that's how you get into this mess.
And again, some of us remember Phil Graham. Remember that? Got more people in the wagon than people pulling the wagon. Remember that
indeed.
Line? And he used to get in so much trouble for saying that, but the numbers seem to sort of bear them out. So nevertheless, one of the articles we've posted here is we have enough taxes, according to Kevin Williamson. And I might just mention that even though we don't quote from too many IPI scholars because we're oftentimes having you in here, if you go to IPI.org KSI.org, you've done a very good job of really talking about the impact that some of these economic policies are having and why we need to just think about this as well in terms of what. And matter of fact, I've just noticed as we're going to a break, one of the callers said, if the government did a better job of investing money in Social Security, we would have money left for Social Security. So there's a problem, right?
And of course, the government doesn't invest that money. The government borrows that money and puts in an IOU. And so the $2.7 or $8 trillion it's supposed to have in Social Security Trust Fund has actually all been borrowed.
It's all IOUs. That sounds like a Ponzi scheme, since we did mention Ponzi once or twice today. Let's take a break. We have a few more topics, one of which, if you're listening right now on the computer, Penna Dexter's commentary is on Define a Woman. We'll talk about that right after this.
A couple of weeks ago, University of Pennsylvania senior Leah Thomas won an NCAA championship in women's swimming, setting an Ivy League time record for the 500-yard freestyle. Thomas, a former male swimmer for Penn, has dominated the female competition this year. Commentator and podcaster Matt Walsh observed Leah's demeanor at the winner's podium. Thomas, he writes, did not make any effort at all to sound or appear womanly. He was accepted as a woman because he declared himself to be so. Parents who complained in a letter about Thomas's presence in Division I women's swimming said the NC2A dismissed their concerns outright. Mr. Walsh pointed out that the left makes little effort to explain, defend, or justify gender ideology. They just demand that it is obeyed and expect that to be the end of the conversation. Indeed, Senator Marsha Blackburn tried to have a conversation about this issue when, in a hearing conducted by the Senate Judiciary Committee, she asked President Biden's Supreme Court nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson, to provide a definition for the word woman. The nominee replied that she could not and stated, "I am not a biologist." USA Today's report on the exchange stated, quote, "Scientists, gender law scholars, and philosophers of biology said Jackson's response was commendable, though perhaps misleading. It's useful, they say, that Jackson suggested science could help answer Blackburn's question, but they note that a competent biologist would not be able to offer a definitive answer either. Scientists agree there is no sufficient way to clearly define what makes someone a woman. And with billions of women on the planet, there is much variation." End quotes. It's almost comical to watch the media tiptoe around the word woman. When Arizona legislators passed a 15-week abortion ban, one article stated that abortion advocates are warning that the ban would be harmful to people who can get pregnant. People who can get pregnant. Why didn't Ketanji Jackson think of that? For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention the Penna Dexter's commentary today, Define a Woman, which apparently is getting more and more difficult, so I did want you to know that is there. And our last article talks about how the Disney Corporation was silent on this issue of parental rights until public pressure. And, of course, that pressure came from the Human Rights Commission and others that were actually encouraging the CEO, who really did not want to address those issues, issues to actually go and begin to address those topics. And it's interesting because they have shown in some of the polls that right now there's even a survey. What was it here? Yes, there is a actual petition being passed around at Disney by a number of employees who actually want to stay neutral on this fight about Florida and all of the rest. Of course, you have a lawsuit and all of the rest that relates to this. But I'd love to go around the roundtable, just get some comments about this, because if you're trying to destroy your brand, Disney is doing a very good job fighting an issue having to do with parental rights, don't you think?
I think so. And in addition, they are only focusing on Florida. And it's pointed out many times that there are other places that Disney's had a role in China and by creating a film close to where the Uyghurs are being held in re-education camps and other things of that nature. And Disney did not protest those. They went right ahead with it. And so you just see the hypocrisy in some of these things. It's just amazing that happens that way. And it takes me back to, when Joe Biden would talk about how bad some of the states are that were changing their election laws. And then you'll have Karl Rove or somebody come up and say, well, wait a minute, Joe, they're in New York. They don't allow this and this and this, but you say that's terrible. And then here's another state that you're from that doesn't allow these various things. And you think it's terrible and that this is the new Jim Crow.
Well, again, just a terrible way to ruin your brand, don't you think, if you want to attract families and everything else?
Yeah, because, it's the moms and dads who spend the money. Okay. And so, a lot of moms and dads who are probably pretty regular customers of Disney movies and it's not cheap to take your kids to Disney World or to take them to Disneyland. Okay.
Yeah.
It costs a lot of money. You are basically telling them that you want to indoctrinate their kids into an ideology that they vehemently disagree with. But please still go fork over the thousands of dollars to bring your kids, to Disney World. It's not a sound market strategy by any stretch, but I really don't think some of these companies in corporate America that are doing this, they don't look at it in terms of dollars and cents.
No, they don't care. Ideology trumps everything.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The free market solution to this is not
wokeism. Is okay.
Is not working.
Wokeism, by the way, will make you broke. I mean, if you tried to run a company or a small business, let's look at it this way, with woke philosophy, you would go broke. It's only the wealthy companies that are Apple and Amazon and, of course, Coca-Cola, as well as, of course, the one we're talking about right now, Disney. They can afford to be woke and still lose money because, after all, they are big enough to take that hit. But I think a small business, can you imagine a plumber saying, I'm going to be woke about all the things I do and I'm going to talk about this every day when I walk into people's homes. You're not going to get invited back, are you?
No, of course not. But it's the people at the top of those companies, the CEOs, the board of directors, who their bottom line, their own personal bottom line is not going to be impacted.
Right.
What's more important to them is the social capital, right? Which cocktail parties are they not going to get invited to if they don't do this? And I think the only way you change this in corporate America, in corporate circles, is we have to convince the people because they see this as the moral high ground,
right? As
twisted as that is, they think they are doing what's right. And I think the only way this stops is when it becomes clear that the actual morally superior position for a corporation is to be neutral on these things,
right?
Because
stay out of the culture wars.
Because your customer base is divided on it. Your employees are divided on it. And you have to respect all of your employees. If you're going to have a director of diversity, and inclusion, you have to include even the people who don't agree with you, right? You can't. you can't just be inclusive of one point of view.
And we should mention that even a lot of these corporations are faced with a woke mob that's much more aggressive than the average family.
That's exactly right. This article says it was public outcry. It was just as much internal outcry from their own employees who didn't like this bill and were demanding that Disney do something.
And some of these CEOs who don't want to get involved with it will just say to their people, how do I make this go away? Just make this go away so we aren't getting all this negative attention. Disney went further than that, but it's that many of them don't want to get involved, but the woke mob is too vocal to keep them that they can stay under the cover.
I love we posted some of these videos yesterday, but one of them from the diversity and inclusion manager at Disney said, we are no longer going to say ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls in any of our theme parks. You know, that, and again, I just keep saying that's the hill to die on, fighting against this particular piece of legislation that is supported by Republicans in Florida, and by the way, in the latest survey, supported by Democrats in Florida, and certainly supported by the people that are probably going to reelect Ron DeSantis. And that's the hill to die on. I have no understanding of that.
If Mickey Mouse decides to become Minnie Mouse, I'm through with it.
It's greatest line of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's he's going to put another female out of a job, right? If you can define what that is, right?
Well, I always love these guys because they've got so many great one-liners. But just before we're running out of time, since I'm looking at my clock, let me just mention that next week we're going to have our Truth Team. So you're going to have a chance to hear from George Barna and Gene Getz and Jerry Newcomb and Gary Bauer and Chuck Bentley and Eric Metaxas, Robert Knight, to mention just a few. And, of course, we'll have our weekend edition with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. But, again, I've been talking to Dr. Merrill Matthews about IPI.org. What do we find when we land there?
Well, we find a lot of material available there. We occasionally do Zoom conferences that people can sign up for as well. Most of everything is free, so we encourage people to go and read the material, download it, share it, and do whatever you want to with it.
I do have two of your articles, so that will take people immediately to IPI.org. Lathan Watts, if people click on your picture, it will take them to First Liberty, and they can then find a number of things. But you have firstliberty.org, but you also have videos and a number of other resources. So talk about what's available there.
Yeah, so firstliberty.org, that's the home site. That's where you find information about our cases. Coach Kennedy's case will be at the Supreme Court here in a couple weeks on the 25th. The ongoing saga of the Navy SEALs and all the other things that we're working on there. FirstLibertyLive.com is our own little kind of in-house video production where we interview sometimes clients, sometimes other newsmakers. And you can see old episodes there. And if you need our help, right at the top of the page at firstliberty.org, Get Legal Help is the button to click, and it's a simple form to let us know what's going on with you, and if we can help, we will. We also have resources to kind of help you protect yourself if you go to firstliberty.org/resources, which makes sense, hopefully. You can find a lot of information there as well.
And let me just mention again that since it is now the month of April 1st. I don't think we did any April Fool jokes today. But again, later this month, that's when the oral arguments for Coach Kennedy. So that's a prayer target. I mean, pray for a lot of these things here, including, of course, this ongoing war in Ukraine, and pray for those in positions of leadership. But I'd also encourage you to pray for some of these cases. You have basically 3 cases before the Supreme Court, don't you?
Right. So the Supreme Court did actually take some action on the SEALs last week. Yeah. So that case is now back down at the District Court and the Fifth Circuit on several issues. But Coach Kennedy will be argued on the 25th, and we're still waiting on the Carson versus Macon school choice opinion to come out by the end of June.
Well, thank you both for being here. I want to thank Doug for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer. Have a great weekend. Well, we're going to watch March Madness, even if we didn't root for some of those candidates and some of those colleges. And we'll see you back here on Monday on Truth Team.
How has Point of View shaped your point of view? For the last half-century, Point of View has brought light to the culture thanks to the partnership of listeners and supporters like you. That's right, it's been 50 years. To celebrate our 50-year anniversary, Point of View wants to hear from you. Has Point of View ever inspired you to take action? Do you feel your faith and Christian worldview have been strengthened by the program? If so, share your story with us. Email it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Point of View would be nothing without you. You are Point of View's legacy. Don't let that legacy be forgotten. Share your story today. Tell the next generation how Point of View impacted your life. Your testimony could even be featured on the program. Again, share it to story@pointofview.net or call 800-347-5151. Story@pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.